How do we actually know if an economy is doing well? If a country says its economy is growing, what does that really mean? And if one country is richer than another, how do we measure that? In this lesson, we're going to explore one of the most important concepts in macroeconomics, GDP, which is Growth Domestic Product. But more importantly, we'll also ask, does GDP really tell us everything about living standards? Economists and governments need ways to measure the performance of their economy. They want to compare different countries, different time periods, and changes in living standards. The most widely used measure is GDP. In this lesson, we'll explore what GDP actually measures, how it is calculated, its strengths, and its limitations. Because while GDP is incredibly useful, it doesn't tell the full story. So, what exactly is GDP? GDP is the total value of all final goods and services produced within a country over a given period of time. There are a few key things to understand here. First, GDP only counts final goods, not intermediate goods, to avoid double counting. Second, production must occur within the country. And third, GDP measures output, not wealth. Also, GDP is what economists call a flow measure, meaning it measures activity over time, like per year, rather than total accumulated wealth. So GDP is really about how much an economy produces, not how much it owns. Interestingly, there are three different ways to calculate GDP, but they should all give the same answer. The first is the output method, which adds up the value created at each stage of production. The second is the income method, which adds up all the incomes earned, like wages, profits, and rents. And the third is the expenditure method, which adds up the total spending in the economy. This includes consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Even though these approaches look different, they are all just different ways of measuring the same economic activity. Now, here's an important distinction. Nominal GDP measures output using current prices, but there's a problem. If prices increase, inflation, nominal GDP may rise even if actual production hasn't changed. That's why economists focus on real GDP. Real GDP adjusts for inflation, giving a clearer picture of actual growth and output. So when you hear that an economy is growing, economists are usually talking about real GDP, not nominal GDP. Now, to compare living standards, economists often use GDP per capita. This simply means GDP divided by the population. It gives a rough estimate of average income per person. For example, a country with a high GDP but a very large population may not actually be very rich per person. However, GDP per capita has an important limitation. It's just an average. It doesn't show how income is distributed. So a country could have high GDP per capita but still have significant inequality. GDP is useful, but it has several important limitations. First, it does not measure well-being. Things like happiness, health, and leisure are not included. Second, it ignores inequality. An average can hide large differences between rich and poor. Third, GDP excludes the informal economy, such as unpaid work or black market activity. And interestingly, GDP can even count negative outcomes positively. For example, cleaning up pollution increases GDP even though pollution itself is harmful. Finally, GDP does not capture sustainability. If a country depletes its natural resources, GDP may rise in the short term, but long term well being could fall. So GDP is useful, but definitely incomplete. Now, because GDP has these limitations, economists often use alternative indicators. The example, the Human Development Index, which includes health and education, life expectancy, which reflects overall well-being, education levels, which affect long-term growth, and environmental indicators, which measure sustainability. These indicators give a more complete picture of quality of life, not just economic output. So when evaluating an economy, economists rarely rely on GDP alone. Now, let's connect this to education again. Investment in education improves productivity and economic growth in the long run. However, improvements in education quality may not immediately show up in GDP figures. This highlights an important limitation of GDP. It often focuses on short-term output rather than long-term development. So a country investing heavily in education may not see immediate GDP growth, but could benefit greatly in the future. In the next lesson, we'll build on this by looking at two major macroeconomic challenges, inflation and unemployment. We'll explore how they are measured and why they matter so much for economic stability. Now let's summarize the key ideas. GDP measures the total value of output in an economy. It can be calculated using three different methods. Real GDP is used to measure actual growth. GDP per capita gives a rough idea of living standards. However, GDP has important limitations. It does not fully capture well-being, inequality, or sustainability. So while GDP is a powerful tool, it should always be used alongside other indicators. Thank you.